Okay, so we're back up and running over here. Says you can release your order video here. I'm not sure what that is. Okay. All right, King David. That's our discussion of tonight's class. I want to thank all of you for joining again. God bless you all. And people are trickling in over here, so let's just give it like another 30 seconds. And we're looking good over here. Jamie, I'm happy that you're on board. All right, very good. Okay, so we finished this very gory military difficult ending of Shaul HaMelech, of King Saul, and it ended with his suicide, basically. This was following his encounter that he had with this witch, Ov, who told him that he's going to die in battle. Remember, we discussed this in chapter 31 of Samuel 1. And the book of Samuel 2 begins with a messenger coming to King David and letting him know that the great king Shaul HaMelech died in battle. And this messenger in Samuel 2, the book of Samuel 2, it states that it was an Amalekite. There was an Amalekite individual, which is already a bit tricky because we remember that Saul pretty much wiped out the Amalekite nation. Besides the king, King Agag, A-G-A-G. So it's a little bit funny when we say that there was an Amalekite individual, a renegade, who came to the secret hideout of King David and told him that the former Jewish king, King Saul, was killed in battle. And so, as you remember, David was in hiding. He was in hiding with 200 of his men, of his friends, and he was hiding under the jurisdiction of this King Nachash, and he was pretending that he was helping this non-Jewish king, but of course, King David was like the secret, he was more than a secret spy. He was this military man allowing to live in hostile territory, but this non-Jewish king let King David live free and clear because this non-Jewish king knew that King Saul was trying to kill King David. This was public knowledge. And David tells this non-Jewish king where he's at, King Nachash, trust me, I don't like King Saul any more than you do. So he let him be. So he sort of got protection from this non-Jewish king in hostile in enemy territory. Eventually, this same king with his generals ends up killing King Saul. So this Amalekite runs to the secret encampment where King David was. Now, again, he wasn't called King David. He was just David. He was the son-in-law of King Saul, and says that King Saul was killed in battle. So David says, and how do you know? How do you know that he was truly killed? This question of how do you truly know is a very, very big question. It's not enough when the media says something, and it's not enough when WhatsApp and chat rooms say something. You have to really know if the king was really killed. This is an issue we're having right now in Florida. We know that there's 151 people basically killed under the rubble. But how do you really know? Where's the evidence? I'm just trying to find, yeah, everyone's muted over here. Just mute yourself, guys. Unless you have a question, by all means, you're more than welcome to ask a question. Although Miriam, who's a scholar, knows that most of the questions end up being answered throughout the class. But if something is not clear, by all means. So how do you really know is that? So how do we really know that if someone really passed away in the rubble in Surfside in Florida? Now these are serious questions, because you can have a married woman who wants to remarry because her husband was, let's say, in that building and she was on vacation in New York. And it's not enough to say that a building collapsed so she can go and remarry. She's called an aguna, unless she got a divorce. This is something that we're going to be discussing today in today's class with King David and Bathsheba. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the point is, you need evidence. And to say that a building collapsed and it's been 14 days, that's still not enough evidence. So you have a DNA machine on site, and rabbis are trying to ascertain to help the families. I have a friend that's just started sitting Shiva today because yesterday they found the bodies. I hate to say the word lucky them that they found the bodies, but lucky them that there's clarity. And we had these same issues with 9/11 when a building collapsed. So we can presume people are dead 14 days later, but we need evidence. And it's a big feat. It's a very big deal. So this person tells King David, I myself killed him. I myself killed King Saul. So he's giving testimony that I myself killed King David. King David says, you killed King Saul? He says, yes. So when someone gives self-testimony, this is what we call maybe circumstantial evidence, but there is some evidence over here. And King David tells his general, kill this individual, kill this Amalekite, for doing a terrible act of killing King Saul. Now, all of us who were here in last week's class are asking the obvious question. It was said clearly that King Saul killed himself. Chapter 31 of Samuel 1 says, King Saul fell on his sword, and his children did the same. And they did this lest the enemy go and kill them. So how can King David go and order the execution of an individual when he never did the actual killing? Good question, Scott. I can't go down that road right now, but it is a fair question. And the rabbis on site are dealing with that in regards to evidence. But it's a fair question. What is considered evidence? When a person jumps off a building into a furnace, is that considered evidence enough that he was killed? If a person jumped off a boat into the ocean and the boat left and came back to the shore, to the seaside, how many days do we have to wait and assume that the guy lived or the guy didn't live? And the rabbis give responses. If it's a lake is one thing. If it's a river, it's another thing. If it's an ocean, it's another thing. As far as recovering bodies, but it's a bit above my pay grade, and especially in regards to agunot, for women who want to remarry, and these are issues that are happening right now as we speak in Surfside. So this is the circumstantial evidence that was given to King David, but we have the conflict with, we thought in Samuel 1 he killed himself, and now we have this Amalekite that says I killed King Saul. So the commentaries deal with this, and they say the following, that King Saul indeed fell on his sword, so that's true, but he didn't completely die. And he pleaded with help through pain and agony with this Amalekite, with this enemy, please finish my life. And this Amalekite listened and obeyed the king, and he did what he did. So this sort of solves that issue. Now, to answer what I said before about the Amalekite, a lot of the commentaries say that this was not an Amalekite. When we open up chapter 1 in Samuel 2, which will begin the life of King David, we can only begin it when we finish the life of King Saul, who was the reigning king prior to King David. So the commentators say this was not an Amalekite, but this person was was King Saul's assistant, whose name was Doeg HaAdomi. And we spoke about him in last class, D-O-E-G. He was a religious Jew. But here we see that the book, the prophets, is calling this religious Jew, Doeg, who was also a Talmid Chacham. We're calling him an Amalekite. Not just a non-Jew, but a hater of the Jewish people. So the book of Samuel is giving a verdict in continuation with what we discussed last week, that this Doeg is like an Amalekite, and he acts like an Amalekite. We saw that he ordered the execution of the high priest in Nov and the 82 kings, the priests by the tabernacle over there. So he was always up to no good. He was the one that questioned King David's right to be Jewish because he came from Ruth and the Moabite and all these things. What's interesting to note is that King Saul, who was always trying to get feedback and advice from this individual, Doeg HaAdomi, it turned out that at the end, King Saul's life ended with the same individual who pretended as he was being a religious individual. And this is why Osed answers why King David killed Doeg HaAdomi. Because you could have asked, he was just a messenger. He just listened to King Saul to finish off his life. Why should he be executed? He was listening to the King Saul. And he came to bring a message to King David that I finished the job of what King Saul started, which was suicide, and I finished his life. Why should he be executed? Well, once we hear from the commentators that he's not just an Amalekite, but he's an individual that acts like an Amalekite, and his name is Doeg HaAdomi, that chapter 1 of the opening of Samuel 2 becomes a lot more clear. Okay. So now David is in enemy territory. He knows, and his people know, and the Jewish people know that he was already anointed during Saul's time to be the next king. But he's not sure what his next move is. So what do? You pray. So in his case, he went to the high priest, a replacement of the high priest. And his name was, don't tell me. I don't see it here. I think his name was Evyatar. I think I mentioned that last class, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think his name was Evyasar or Evyatar. And he asked him to look at the stones. We keep on seeing the Urim V'Tumim, the breastplates of the high priest. And you ask certain questions and the stones light up in different ways. And it said Hebron. So this was David's cue to take his general, Yoav, and his people, and they went to Hebron. Because that's what it said. Why Hebron? Because as we know, Hebron is in the tribe of Judah. It's a 40-minute drive from Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was being inhabited by Philistines and other non-Jewish people. Hebron was already the tribe of Judah, which was much more settled. And furthermore, King David came from the tribe of Judah. And to make matters more complicated, all the 12 tribes of the Jewish people weren't so hot and heavy of King David. They already saw the failure of the monarchy through King Saul. And King Saul came from which tribe, Alan? From the tribe of Benjamin. So basically, he was the king of all the 12 tribes. So when King David, who's from the tribe of Judah, not from Benjamin, is going to become the next king, he has to go to the capital, to his home base. And his home base is in the tribe of Judah, which is Hebron. And from there, he can start the monarchy with himself, with his family, with his generals, and then he can spill out to over different parts of Israel. But Benjamin is a hostile tribe towards David. Benjamin wants the monarchy to stay in the tribe of Benjamin. And we don't have a prophet by the name of Samuel who can make this public rally and rally all the Jewish people to get behind David. Samuel passed away. King Saul passed away. King Saul's children now passed away, all killed in battle. King David is somewhat bruised up with being on the run from King Saul for all this time. So the Urim V'Tumim, the breastplate of the high priest, told King David to take your people, your 200 people, and go to Hebron, to your hometown in the tribe of Judah. But it wasn't so simple, because Saul's general, his name was Avner. Avner was a mighty man. The books say he was like a Zeus. It took 4 people just to wrap their arms around his legs. They say it took 4 people to try to push him down. He was a strong man. He was a real general. Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. He was a strong, monstrous of a guy. And this Avner didn't want to lose position of being a general of the king. And he was always on the hunt to kill King David. So he wasn't so keen on this whole idea of David going to Hebron and starting a new monarchy. So he put one of Saul's children there. His name was Ishbosheth. Just want to make sure I'm saying this correctly. Yeah, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth. That's his name. So Avner put in position Saul's son, and Avner is basically running around telling all the Jewish people, forget King David. We have a new king. Saul died. The descendants go to his son, and his son is Ishbosheth. And I, Avner, with my military power, will make sure that the Jewish people will stay strong and that the monarchy will stay in Saul's family in the tribe of Benjamin. So there's already politics happening between King Saul's descendant, Ishbosheth, the monarchy of King Saul, which is the family, and of course, the people in the tribes of Benjamin. And of course, they want, it's like, who wants, the people of Washington, D.C. like that. The White House is in Washington, D.C. They don't want to see it move all of a sudden to Orange County. So it becomes a bit tricky. Now you may ask, Avner was a religious Jew as well. And if you remember in the last classes, when we always talk about King Saul and King David, we have to take it with a grain of salt, because King Saul is a religious person as well. He always listened to the prophet. So that's why the commentators are always in the Talmud, are always coming to the defense of King Saul when he does something wrong, of King David when he does something wrong. So here as well, Avner is a religious man. Avner knows that the breastplate is stating clearly that King David should be the next king. So why is he making this, so to speak, this coup? And he's stating that it should be his boss, King Saul. So Avner, who is a religious Jew, knows from the verses in the Torah, and he knows that Jacob told his child, Benjamin, Melachim mechalatzecha yetzeu, that kings will come out of your loins, from the tribe of Benjamin. Not king, kings, plural. So Avner knows crystal clearly, based on the Bible, when Jacob blessed his child Benjamin, that kings are going to come forth from the tribe of Benjamin. So Avner saw in front of his eyes Saul was a king. He did not disagree that King David should be the next king, or that King David should be a king of the Jewish people. Avner thought that there should be one more king before King David. There should be one more king from the tribe of Benjamin before the monarchy transitions to the tribe of Judah. So he felt Ishbosheth, Saul's son, should be the next king. So again, it may have been a mistake, but it has to come with reason. He is not considered a Doeg Adomi who's just a killer. Avner is a Talmid Chacham. Avner actually was the one that told King Saul, don't worry if King David becomes your son-in-law. Because Doeg Adomi said, King David comes from Ruth the Moabite. It was Avner, the religious man, that said, no, King David he's fine. He comes from good stock. So now that Avner is in opposition to King David, it's not that he doesn't want King David to ever become king. It's just not yet. We need one more king to come from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm just laying down some of the politics. We have our own politics today in 2021. We have, our own, the Congress, and we have legislation. So there was a bit of politics, but again, the books kind of go through it. So Avner and Joab. Avner is the king for Saul. Joab, Joab, Joab in Hebrew, is the king, is the general for King David. Again, Avner is the general for Saul, who now is the general for Ishbosheth, Saul's son, representing the tribe of Benjamin, trying to take full control over the land of Israel. You have on the other side, Joab, who's the general for King David, who's located in Hebron. And basically they say, instead of us fighting and killing tens of thousands of people and having a civil war, I'm going to designate 12 military soldiers, Marines. You're going to designate 12 of your own top fighters, paratroopers, and they're going to have a duel. Like you used to have in the West with Clint Eastwood, you had a duel. So we're gonna have a duel with 12 people on each side. And what would you know? Like all duels that happened 100 years ago, all 12 of them on each side die. It was a bloodbath. So they say, let's make a truce. Enough's enough. Avner and Yoav make a peace. Avner goes back to the tribe of Benjamin. Yoav goes back to the tribe of Hebron. They're there. And basically there's a bit of a peace, probably for like a few weeks. Finally, after some time, Avner comes to Hebron himself, and he says, I want to beg for mercy. Enough's enough. And I want to pledge my allegiance to King David. This happened after one more fight that takes place in the book of Samuel, where Yoav's brother Asahel, Asahel, they had a skirmish, Asahel, Yoav's brother, and Avner. Now, Avner, as I said before, was this mighty general, so Asahel didn't have a chance. And Avner ends up killing Asahel in a battle. So a few weeks later, when Avner comes to Hebron to basically make peace, and now there's going to be this reunification amongst all 12 tribes, Yoav, who is also a general, King David agrees and accepts his apology and forgiveness. Yoav says the same. And on Avner's way back home, Yoav goes and kills Avner, the great general of King Saul. And this was unfortunate, but in a weird way, this brought the people even closer together, because King David sat Shiva. We see in the book he sits Shiva. He went to the funeral. This is a king who leaves his palace in Hebron and goes with the procession to this funeral for Avner. Remember, Avner was a guy that was chasing down David for years. And now King David is going to his funeral. Of course, he's upset with his general Yoav, but he's not going to do anything because he understands that Yoav is also this mighty, wild general. And King David just wants to make peace with everybody. So he leaves that alone. Yoav will have his own day in court a little bit later, but King David, again, is just trying to bring the reunification. There was some groups of people that thought King David was behind this attack on Avner being killed. But after King David himself truly weeping and crying and going with his funeral procession and then sitting Shiva with the sackcloths and everything else, it becomes clear that this was an isolated event. This was Yoav doing his own thing. And there becomes now, for the first time, peace amongst, not for the first time, but in that time of Jewish history, there's peace amongst all the 12 tribes. There's peace with Saul's entire, how do you say this in the White House? The cabinet. Saul's cabinet makes complete peace and integrates with King David, and the Jewish people become one. There's 12 tribes, but there's truly one monarchy, one reigning superpower under King David. And all the people from all the tribes come down to Hebron and coronate him as the next Jewish king of the Jewish people. So this was a major, major event that takes place in Hebron, which is the coronation of all the 12 tribes of all the Jewish people. And that was the first time and the last time that ever happened. Because after that, the kings moved to Jerusalem, as we'll see in a moment, and all the coronations and palaces always took place in Jerusalem. So when they ever talk about, well, this is where King David lived, this was his palace, this is where his father Jesse is buried, this is all a very small period of time of those 7.5 years when King David was living in Hebron. But once all the Jewish people, all the tribes coronated King David in Hebron and said, he is our king, he no longer needs to be stuck in his backyard in Hebron in the tribe of Judah, but now he makes his way to Jerusalem. And this is now basically for the first time where Jerusalem comes onto the scene. So for all those that care about some current politics about Jerusalem, only now in chapter 5 of Samuel 2 does it come onto the picture. Because the books that we were learning till now, the discussion, the focus has really nothing to do with Jerusalem. Okay. Now, in chapter 5 of Samuel, there's something very interesting here. King David comes with his army, and now he wants to capture Jerusalem, right? In Hebron, he's living peacefully. He's living nice. It's like living in Washington, in his own Washington, D.C. Now you want to come to Jerusalem, it's going to cost you some people, it's going to cost you some lives, because he has to do battle. The opposition, the Philistines, they make a very weird quote. Listen to this quote, what they tell King David's soldiers. They say the following: "You shall not enter here." This is in chapter 5. "You shall not enter here unless you remove the blind and the lame." The blind and the lame, L-A-M-E. This is what the Philistines, the enemies of the Jewish people, are telling King David's army. The blind and the lame. There are 3 interpretations on what this sentence means before King David initiates the attack and captures Jerusalem. Number one, these Philistines inserted into the mouth of these 2 statues. You know, like in fancy homes in Beverly Hills or Bel Air, you have these lions at the front entrance of the gates or something. So you can imagine there in Jerusalem, by the entrance, these Philistines put also these huge statues. Doesn't say that they were lions, but these huge statues. And it says they also worship them. And they put into the mouths of these idols, of these statues, a piece of paper or parchment, inscribed in it the oath, the pledge between Avimelech and Abraham. So we're going back 600 years, because you remember that the Jewish people were in Israel roughly 400 years until they built that temple. And Joshua came in at the beginning of that 400-year segment. And you have to count the 210 years of the Jews in Egypt, and then that right there, Abraham. So around 600 years prior, these non-Jews, they remembered this oath and this pledge and this peace treaty, like the United Nations resolution. There was a peace treaty between Abraham and Avimelech that their children and their descendants for many generations is not going to fight and hurt each other and kill each other. So that's what these Philistines said when King David came with his army to capture Jerusalem. They said, "You shall not enter here unless you remove the blind and the lame," referring to the statues that were carrying the pledge of the peace treaty between Abraham and Avimelech. That's interpretation number 1. What that sentence means, according to the second interpretation, is the blind was referring to Isaac, who was blind, and Jacob, who was lame, illustrating Abraham's grandkids were holding up the oath and peace. So it wasn't referring to the statues, but it was referring to Isaac and Jacob, who are descendants of Abraham, who are holding up this peace treaty, and you, King David, and your army have to also uphold this peace treaty between our grandparents, between Avimelech and Abraham. So you do not have a right to enter Jerusalem. The third interpretation of what this statement means is the city is so well guarded, the Philistines are telling to David, you cannot conquer it even if it were guarded only by the blind and the lame. Because this is such a wonderful fortified city, even if there was only people who are blind and lame who didn't know even how to hold a sword and a gun, you'll never be able to penetrate this city. That is the third interpretation of this one-line verse that states in Samuel 2. Of course, King David knew that this was just a ploy. First of all, the pact, the peace treaty was only for 3 generations, that the Talmud tells us, so David does not have to uphold this pact no longer. Furthermore, the Philistines already broke this pact with allowing Goliath to come and do what he did during the times of King Saul. And of course, with Eli, the high priest, we know that the Philistines captured the tabernacle from Shiloh. So they never held their part of the bargain. It's kind of like today when you have Arabs launching thousands of missiles and then they get bent out of shape. How can Israel launch missiles back? What are you doing? What are you doing? This is a hostile group. So this sort of is nothing new to us. And we saw that with the Philistines, who were only causing harm to the Jewish people. And now when King David wants to come in strong and heavy, all of a sudden the Philistines are saying, oh no, there was a pact, there's a treaty between Abraham and Avimelech. So David says, have a nice day, and he orders the attack. And he captures the main fortress of Jerusalem, which is called Mitsudat, Mitsudat Sion, which means Mitsudat is a fortress, and Sion is excellent, like from the word Mitsuyan. So that is what David captures from the Philistines, Mitsuyan Sion. Of course, later in history, we know that we call that today Mitsudat David, the Tower of David, the Fortress of David, which we still have today. When you enter through the Jaffa Gate, you know that we have David's Tower, or Mitsudat David. But in the beginning of time, at least from the book of Samuel, it is obviously not called Mitsudat David. This was a Mitsudah, a fortress that was built and fortified by the Philistines, and it was an excellent one, and thus it was called Mitsudat Sion, an excellent one. I'm wondering, as I'm speaking to you, that that's perhaps where you get the word Zionism from. Zion, Z-I-O-N, really means Zion. Zion, 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 Tzadik, Yud, Vav, Nun, Zion, may come from the word Mitsuyan, excellent, which is the same word that we're using here, Mitsudat Sion. And since it was David who captured this fortress, we may have associated the word excellent with Sion, which is Zion, and we always associated David and Jerusalem with Zion, later to become Zionism. But that is, perhaps I'll look into that a little bit more. But now that I'm thinking about it, that's maybe where the word Zion or Zionism comes from the word Sion. Now I'm going to Zion, Utah in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to that. And I don't know if they know that certainly where the word, they may know Zion is a biblical name, but I don't think they know the story about Mitsudat Sion. Okay, anyways, moving along. So that was just an interesting thing. So 7.5 years after David became king, and he's in Hebron, he then makes the move after everyone coronates him as the king, not just of the tribe of Judah, but the tribe of all 12 tribes. Then he makes the move and he goes into Jerusalem. Okay. After now he captures, he's in Jerusalem, and now he's basically home sweet home. I don't want to say the word home sweet home because home sweet home is back in Hebron, but we'll call it the capital of the Jewish people, because this is where he's going to build his home. And this is where he wants to bring the ark. And this is where eventually his son Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, will build the Beit HaMikdash, all in Jerusalem. I'm not going to go into it right now why Jerusalem is so special. Why is David coming to Jerusalem? It's in the tribe of Benjamin and a little bit also in the tribe of Judah. But all we're speaking right now is simply about history. He was in Hebron for 7.5 years, and now he wants to come to Jerusalem. Now that he got Jerusalem, he then asks the prophet Nathan and says, Nathan, I want to build God's edifice. I want to build God's home. Because already in the Torah it talks about God having a home. And I want to dwell in it. I want to dwell in my house. The house until now was the tabernacle. The tabernacle was in Shiloh, and then it was in Novan, and it was in Givon. But David says, I want to build, I'm a king, I have money, I want to really build a home now. And Nathan says, the prophet says, no, no, no. You cannot build a home. You cannot build the Beit HaMikdash. It will be through your son, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. Why? Because King David was too engulfed in battle. He was involved in too much war, killing Goliath, killing so many people with his small soldiers when it came to defending himself from King Saul. Even though he was mostly defending himself, but a lot of bloodshed occurred because or through King David. Never mind that the high priest in Nov and the 82 priests Kohanim were killed by Doeg HaAdomi, if not for David going there to get Goliath's sword, as we discussed in the past, those people would have never been murdered by Doeg HaAdomi. Now, of course, it's not David's fault. It's Doeg HaAdomi's fault, King Saul's advisor, for killing those people. But he killed them because they helped out David. And David was an enemy, persona non grata. So there was too much blood shed that happened because of King David. And as a result, Nathan tells David, you're not going to build the Beit HaMikdash, but it'll be through your son. Fine. So Nathan agrees to this. So David agrees to this. And there's beautiful verses that discuss, unlike Moses, who was in opposition to not being able to be buried in Israel, David, in his humility, did not utter one word of objection. He said, fine. Like, whatever God wants from me, I'm just God's messenger. So what's the next order of business that occurs? This is after chapter 7 in Samuel. He decides, at the very least, let me bring the ark. You know, the Raiders of the Lost Ark didn't just happen after the destruction of the temple. We didn't know where the ark was. Because I'll fill you in on a secret, which I guarantee Steven Spielberg knew. In the second temple, that ark no longer existed. So when the temple was destroyed, and everyone says, oh, where's the ark? Everyone knew the ark was gone way before the temple was destroyed. Actually, say our books, they say the scriptures, that the ark never even made it into the second temple. It only was around in the first temple. So I'd like to say that the lost ark is the ark that had no temple. There was an ark, not the unknown ark, but there was an ark. While David was being king for 7.5 years in Hebron, but only now, because he came to Jerusalem and he captured this fortress from the Philistines, and Nathan told David, you cannot build the Beit HaMikdash. David says, at the very least, let me bring the ark to Jerusalem and give it a home. And if you remember, we explained in weeks classes ago, there was a Holy of Holies, Jamie, but there was no ark. There was a menorah and other things in there. So the ark was for 20 years, as we mentioned, in a city called Kiryat Ye'arim. Kiryat Ye'arim. During those 20 years, some of those years, roughly 11 of those years was during Samuel's time. Then 2.5 years during King Saul's time. Even when King Saul was king in tribe of Benjamin, he did not have the ark. And then if you add 7.5 years of when King David was king in Hebron, now you have a total of 20 years. So for 20 years, the ark was not lost, but the wandering ark. We'll call it that. It had no home. So finally, King David is excited to bring the ark finally, from when it was captured by Goliath in the town of Shiloh during the times of the high priest Eli. And then the ark was a little bit wandering until finally was situated in someone's home in a basement, almost like counterfeit money. It was being hidden by this individual by the name of Avinadav in the town of Kiryat Ye'arim. So finally, King David says, I'm going to make the move, I'm going to bring the ark. So King David brings all his people and civilians from Hebron. He brings people from Jerusalem. He goes, there's thousands of people. He goes to Kiryat Ye'arim. I'm trying to actually see something. I wish I had a picture. Okay. I don't know if you can see this. This is a picture. It's a very bad picture. I'm just holding up a book. It's interesting that of a whole book, the front cover of the book is this picture. You see there King David holding a shofar with the crown. And there's the people bringing the ark. And all these thousands of people there are watching this procession. Now, just to be 100% accurate, this was the second time King David tried to bring the ark to Jerusalem. The first time was an utter failure. Why was it a failure? Because he ordered the ark be put on a wagon, carried by dozens of bulls and horses. He wanted to make like, you have today, you have a funeral, you put a casket on a wagon. And if you want to be very fancy, it's being pulled either by a Bentley or Rolls Royce or 50 white horses. So that's what King David did, all for the honor of the ark, for God and the Torah. What happened was it was a little bit shaky, the ark, the wagon, a little bit, the wooden wheels weren't so good. And the ark slipped off the back of the wagon. And there was a person by the name of Uzi who quickly put out his hand to grab the ark from slipping and touching the floor. Kind of like, God forbid, a Torah should slip and hit the floor. So you grab it, you make a dive, and you try to catch it. So this was an utter flop in front of many, many people. And King David realized something's wrong. And I got to bring the ark back to Abinadab's house. And Uzzah, who took his hand and touched the corner of the ark from falling, he was killed on the spot. So people realize right away something's really not going good over here. Maybe the ark shouldn't come to Jerusalem just yet. Maybe I want to find his exact name. Give me a minute. Yeah, his name is Uzzah. Uzzah, that's his name, yeah. So instead of bringing the ark all the way back to Kiryat Ye'arim, he brings it back to the home of Oved Edom Hagiti. That's his name. He says it in the book. Oved Edom Hagiti. It was only there for 3 months. In that 3 months, this guy became very wealthy. He had a lot of blessings for him and his family. And then David realized, let me show a little bit more respect. Nathan the prophet also told him, you need to show a little bit more respect. So he made a second procession. And the second procession, the ark was not being carried on a wagon, but like you saw in the picture, the ark was being carried by the Levites. Just like the Levites carried the ark in the desert for 40 years, David made the mistake, and maybe he forgot, or he thought to make it more respectful to put it on the wagon, but God wants the ark to be always carried by the Levites. So David went and found the Levites, and for the second attempt, there's hundreds of Levites, thousands of Jewish people. In addition, every few feet, he stopped the procession to bring sacrifices to God for this huge celebration. As you saw in the picture I just showed you, David is dancing almost like a clown in a circus to be excited. And everyone should be excited. The king is excited that the ark is coming home to Jerusalem. I shouldn't say home, but a new home in Jerusalem, because the ark has yet to be in Jerusalem. And this time it was a successful procession, and the ark comes to Jerusalem. So we're basically right now 9 years, give or take, in the reign of King David, 7.5 years of Hebron, another 2.5 years of what's going on right now in Jerusalem. But we have another 30 years to cover, because we know that King David reigned for 40 years. And a lot of more excitement is going to happen, but I'm short of time. It's already 8:15, and I always promise you guys 45 minutes. So everyone can stay on board. If you have any questions,